thank you for coming to my presentation. My name is George Williams, and I'm going to be presenting causality and anomalous mind-matter interaction. Now, as you might know, according to conventional thinking, there's a tension between these two kinds of things. Anomalous mind-matter interactions such as psychokinesis. Does that really fit with our understanding of the laws of nature? So I'm going to sort of explore that possibility with you. Now, recently, Sean Carroll, sort of a famous cosmologist, has argued that psychokinesis is absolutely inconsistent with the laws of physics. And I have a quote here for you from his blog. This blog was cited by Reber and Alcock in their attack on Cardenya's recent summary of the psi data. So according to Carroll, parapsychologists should just not bother. That is to say, all the studies that we have just have to be necessarily wrong because of our understanding of the laws of physics. Now, I just want to point out that Carroll himself is a very famous advocate of Everett's many-worlds interpretation, which holds that the universe is constantly branching into multiple universes, but he doesn't really have any evidence, or at least there are no observations of alternative universes. So, you know, on the one hand, he wants to sort of practice, you know, ignoring the data, and the other ones, he doesn't really seem to have a lot of use for it. So anyway, that's a bit of an aside. So what I want to talk a little bit about is some implications to this sort of maybe conventional view that all behavior and phenomena is governed by nothing more than mathematical causal relationships that we've uncovered, and maybe if there are some gaps that remain, these will also be sort of the kind of mathematical relationships that you know, similar to what we've already done. But if we sort of take these arguments seriously, we might ask ourselves, well, does this eliminate free will? Does this mean that we might be conscious, but in some sense powerless to make some sort of choices in the world? So the argument does seem to spill over into some sort of some interesting areas. So let's proceed to consider what we really know about reality. And in particular, I'm interested in whether we can simply dismiss data on psychokinesis based on our current knowledge of the laws of nature. And in turn, this leads to some additional questions, such as, you know, what is consciousness? Can we influence the world through free will? Can conscious intention non-locally influence objects in the world? Okay, so so the behavior of the physical world can be understood in terms of regularities, and these can be described in mathematical terms in many cases, especially in physics. But this is a rather surface level understanding of these relationships. Can we probe deeper into the nature of causality? Now, David Hume is probably the most famous philosopher to sort of like start to really think about this. I mean, this is the same David Hume that skeptics have often sort of thrown up as sort of a as someone who would dismiss the parapsychology. But Hume attacked our common sense understanding of causality. For Hume, all we really see are events that are loose and separate, but not truly connected. So the laws of nature for Hume are just summaries or systemizations of the regularities that occur in the world. For Hume, the notion of causality is nothing more than a mental construction that we add from observing the regularities. So this would seem to go against Carroll's argument that the laws of nature as we understand them can be used to kind of to sort of like eliminate things such as psychokinesis. Now, there is another group of philosophers that are very interesting that I want to talk about, who resist Hume's claim that we can't really say anything about causality beyond regularities, but also resist a lot of those who argue that the laws, that there are necessary laws with the kind of properties that I've talked about earlier. That is a more deterministic view. And they advocate something called dispositionalism. Dispositions, by that I mean properties that describe the tendency of a manifestation given a particular circumstance or stimuli. Okay, so consider, for example, a vase we have here. If we drop it, it might break into 2 pieces, it might break into 100 pieces, or it might not break at all. So at the end of the day, it seems like for this kind of case, all we can really do is sort of characterize the behavior in terms of tendencies, dispositions, and potentialities. So here's some additional examples of this are that in addition to the tendency of a glass to break, you have the tendency of a match to ignite when struck, the tendency of smokers to get cancer, the tendency of rubber to stretch when stretch. I'm sorry, of rubber to stretch when we stretch it. Now you might say, well, this is maybe not the most useful way to characterize the world's behavior. We're very used to thinking that the world is just governed by these laws of nature, which are necessary and mathematical. And where we have a lot of uncertainty about the outcomes, maybe it's because there's just a lot of different factors, a lot of different laws at play, lots of complicated initial conditions, but these are all still consistent with necessary and deterministic laws. But an advantage to characterizing the causal world using dispositions is its generality. So we can characterize the physical world in dispositions, but it's a much more useful way to characterize human behavior rather than sort of mathematical laws. We can just simply say, we can really note the tendencies of how people act in a situation. Mental states can be characterized in dispositional terms. For example, I have a tendency to get angry when I'm stuck in traffic. Okay, that's probably a fairly common one, but it really wouldn't make sense to try to reach for some sort of mathematical equation in that kind of way. Dispositionalism is not inconsistent with free will or choice. So, and I'd like to also argue that it seems like this kind of view is a little bit more friendly to our psychokinesis data. Okay. So another sort of argument in favor of dispositionalism is quantum mechanics. And I've written down here sort of an example of a quantum wave function. Here, let's say describing the behavior of 2 electrons that are entangled. The parameters alpha and beta describe the probabilities of finding respective quantum states. And as is well known, the wave function is inherently probabilistic. It looks like, according to quantum mechanics, that at the most fundamental level of physics, the world is governed by irreducible tendencies or potentialities. So, so this is another sort of, I think, helps us argue in favor of a dispositionalist view. Okay, so some additional thoughts. Recent work has observed that quantum mechanics is present in various biological systems. So quantum mechanics and biology are arguably more intimately connected than is previously believed. Therefore, quantum mechanics is not just some kind of like something that's in labs under special conditions. It's probably an important part of our world more than we truly recognize at the moment. Further, quantum systems are extremely context dependent. So the kind of experiments we have in the labs might not really give us good representations of what we'll observe outside the lab. Heisenberg also argued that the probabilities in the quantum superposition that is described by within the Copenhagen framework are sort of real potentialities or real irreducible tendencies. It's almost like it wasn't just simply probability in terms of not in terms of uncertainty, but rather there was like something sort of a real aspect of the world ontologically. So perhaps probabilities are real and fundamental in some sense. So, so the dispositionalist view, I would argue, is more general and useful than one's invoking deterministic laws. And quantum mechanics appears to be more consistent with such a view. So to take a mundane example, we could remember I said a few minutes ago that a smoker tends to get cancer, but smoker doesn't necessitate cancer, no matter how much she smokes, and no matter how much, no matter how much information we know about the smoker, we can't really predict with certainty that they'll get cancer. This corresponds with this dispositionalist view. But if we sort of acknowledge that sort of in medicine, in biology, in psychology, we have this dispositionalist view that we can't really necessitate outcomes, it makes it harder for the psi critic to argue that you have to demonstrate psi on demand in order for us to take the evidence seriously. So this dispositionalist view, I think, is much more friendly to and more supportive for a lot of the psi data. Okay, but now let's come to the question of consciousness. We can sort of ask, how do we fit consciousness into this? Well, what I'd like to sort of like ask is coming back to the nature of causality, is there in some sense something, a fundamental notion of causality? I mean, what is sort of causality in sort of a fundamental sense, or causal power? Hume, as I mentioned, argued that we don't really have access to causality. But consider this this counter argument by William James. James considered our first-person accounts of volition or agency examples of true or fundamental causation. James was suggesting here in this quote an argument for panpsychism. That is, that considering fundamental causes in nature based on our own first-person experience points toward an understanding of how nature itself is conscious. Recently, the philosopher Hedda Morsch has found quite a few quotes in the history of philosophy and some current philosophy that seems to directly perceive causal powers through our experience of agency or will. She further notes that according to many of these thinkers, dispositionality, which characterizes the physical world, and intentionality, which characterizes the mental, seem to share a number of essential features, such as directedness. And they take this to mean that dispositionalism may entail mental intentionality. But this does seem to lead us toward a view of the physical world as inherently conscious or panpsychist. And then we need to ask, well, does that mean particles are conscious, fields, or something else? So at this point, I want to sort of look at Henry Stapp's theory of physics. Henry Stapp has an interesting interpretation of quantum mechanics where nature chooses the outcome. Okay, so in Stapp's view, he borrows from the Copenhagen interpretation, which, as you'll recall, the world is in superposition until there's sort of a collapse. Stapp borrows from Heisenberg's proposal that quantum superposition represents real potentialities or tendencies or potentia. Stapp argued that these potentials are mind-like. So nature has this sort of like sort of mind-like aspect in terms of quantum potentialities. And also that these actual experimental outcomes are the result of the choice of nature in response to the experimenter's choice. So there may be some interpretations of quantum mechanics that suggest that that are very friendly to the notion of free will, that and that quantum mechanics maybe perhaps suggests a way to think about it. Now, I'm a little bit partial to another kind of similar view, but it's a little bit different, notion of a quantum ground. And recently, Ismail and Schaefer argue that the best explanation for correlated yet separated entangled entities is a common ground that coordinates the randomness between possible states of quantum systems. So there's something like something beneath, something ontologically prior, something more fundamental than the observations we see, sort of that's correlating the randomness and holistically influencing the entities of the wave function. So now, I know I'm sort of bringing in a lot here, I apologize, but Russellian monism, Bertrand Russell argued that science gives us only a partial view of reality. That is, it describes the behavior of matter through mathematical relationships, but is silent on what matter ultimately is. So in other words, what is the intrinsic aspect of matter? So what I would like to suggest is maybe this ground, this quantum ground, is the intrinsic aspect of matter. Russell argued that the only knowledge that we have of intrinsic is our direct conscious experience. So putting these two together, we might think that this sort of like this quantum ground is the source of conscious experience. Okay. So this is an argument that I've made recently in another paper, that there are good reasons to think that this sort of quantum ground is the foundation of conscious experience, as well as what governs the behavior of the physical world. So this ground can be characterized as a non-local field of potentialities. And as a ground or field of aware potentialities, it is consistent with both free will and psychokinesis. Okay, so I know that I've sort of given you, that's sort of a lot. I've gone through it really quickly. So let me sort of maybe give you just sort of a little bit of an overview. So our physical world is, I would argue, is better characterized by dispositionalism, tendencies that are non-reducible rather than fixed deterministic laws. Dispositionalism applies much more generally and is more consistent with quantum mechanics than said necessary laws. However, we can also argue that dispositionalism, there are reasons to think that this dispositionalism also entails consciousness. That is to say that there's a sense that what we call dispositionalism is very, very similar to how we would describe mental intentions. And I further argued that consciousness is arguably rooted in sort of this intrinsic or deepest aspect of the world, the quantum ground, which leads us to consider the quantum ground as the foundation for conscious experience. And so therefore, this quantum field of aware potentialities appears to be able to support anomalous mind-matter interaction. Okay, so that's kind of pretty much my talk, and just want to sort of conclude that I think that there is some reason to think that we are kind of fundamentally linked through a sort of a non-local ground of aware unified potential. And thank you very much for your attention.